I know, short people. Okay, so for better or for worse, there are no slides today. So all you have to do is look at the screen, and we're going to take a look at what the REST API is, why do we even have it, and some examples of how it's been used. My name is Morgan. I've been a WordPress developer since 2009. I'm a core contributor for the last 11 releases. I've had code committed, and the last release that came out, 4.8, was a bug fix for the REST API. I've been really spoiled, I'll say it. I've been spoiled by the type of work that I've done and the agencies that I've worked for, that I've been able to work with the people who created the WordPress REST API and actually work, sit and have coffee, talk to them about how this thing is supposed to work and how it really works. And I've worked with some really, really smart people. So throughout the years that I've been doing this, I realized I'm not qualified to give this talk. Like, this is where imposter syndrome kicks in and anxiety kicks in, because I don't belong here. I've got really smart people that I know that belong here. The problem is they're in Australia, in Chicago, and Seattle, so you get stuck with the Oklahoma City guy. Fortunately, I've been doing this long enough that I know how to implement it, but what's really cool is I'm going to share some things with you, some ideas of how the REST API has been used and how others have used it. I'm not good at coming up with creative ideas of how to create things, but I'm really good at the back end of making the data work. So I can show you some examples of how this has been used, show you a little bit about how the back end works, and hopefully you can take some ideas away about how you could implement something like this. So the first off, the thing I'll say is, what is a REST API? And it's okay to be interactive. This is not really me just talking. I mean, it is, but this is kind of an informal time, so it's okay to shout things out, ask questions as we go. Anyone have an idea of what a REST API is? David.
It lets you use different programs together. That's the programming interface, the PI part of it. And REST is like you do it all through the URL. You type everything you want into the URL, and then it brings you something back using your program.
Yeah. So you have a URL, Rick? Rick, don't raise your hand until your mouth is empty.
That's my bad. Okay, so what's the difference between the REST API and the regular API? Is there a difference?
That is a great question. There is a difference, but really just in semantics. So REST, anyone know what REST stands for? Because I didn't until I Googled it last week. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. You know what that means? No one does, because some dude came up with it for his PhD dissertation about 10 years ago. He fell in love with JSON and decided, hey, servers need a way to give me data, and web pages just don't cut it for everything. So he decided, let's make everything return in a structured JSON. So it's going to be an array or an object, or an array of objects. That's it. So when you hit an API, like this one here, I used, earlier today, I used SSL Labs command line analyzer to analyze my site for my SSL certificate. I don't have to think about it because I use Let's Encrypt. My host does it for me automatically. I just assume everything's working. I got an A rating. Yay, I did nothing. All I did was pass in my URL. It hits an endpoint. It gets a bunch of data back. This is what the REST portion of it is. REST is a promise. REST is a promise that every time I ask for data, it's going to come back in a specific format. When you publish those APIs and you publish, this format is going to include this object with this name, this amount of data in it. It doesn't guarantee what that data will be, just how it's going to look. So in this case, I have information about my certificates. I've got the hashes, and you can see the pins and the cert chain and all this fun stuff. All it is just JSON. We're used to seeing this type of stuff. So here's drilling down into that. You can see here's a chain. Chain is an object. Chain has certs. Certs is an array of anonymous objects. So the benefit to the REST API is I don't need to know how any of this is generated. I don't have a clue what's running on their back end. I can visit their website, I can punch in a URL, and I can get the same data on the front end. The question is, how does that data get generated to display in a web page? Well, how normal things. You have a database, you have lookups, you have all this fancy stuff, and then you put it inside of markup. What if I don't care about your markup? What if I have some other app that I'm doing this for, or if I'm doing command line and I want to pipe this in somewhere else? Well, the benefit to the REST is you only have to generate the data once. And internally, you can look up your own REST API, get the data that you have out of your own database, and know that it's always going to be formatted. So when you're onboarding a new developer, you can tell the developer, here is our structure of our data. You can separate the back end from the front end a lot easier because you can have your back end people say, I promise to give you the data this way. I don't care what you do with it. The front end people can say, as long as you give me it this way, I can do whatever I want with it in whatever language that I want, however I want to do this. That's the power of REST, is the power of the promise. Not JavaScript promises, but we'll look at how some JavaScript promises can be used. So this is the SSL Labs API. This is the data you get from it. There's a whole lot of it. Several years ago, there was a kid in Australia, he was a teenager, high school kid, decided he loves WordPress, he wants to use WordPress. WordPress is slow, and it's not easy to get data out of it. So what do? He applied to Google Summer of Code, and he said, hey, I want to build a REST API. And the lead of WordPress said, sure, kid, go ahead and do it. No, literally, we'll sponsor you for the Google Summer of Code, do it. And he wrote a plugin. And he wrote a plugin that converted everything inside of a WordPress install into a JSON object. And he spit it out, and people said, this is amazing. What are we going to do with it? So the first thing they did was OEmbed. OEmbed, anyone know how to use it? Anyone familiar with it? The cool thing about OEmbed is you are familiar with it. I nearly guarantee that you are. You just may not know that you're familiar with it. So let's take a look at one of these things. So I have a blog post in WordPress. And in that blog post, oh, look, I've got the tweet nicely formatted about today's meeting. And then I have a URL to News OK, who is my parent company's website. I work for the Oklahoman. It does nothing. It's just a link. Well, that's sad. We could fix that. We should fix that. And then we've got another, oh, this is a WordPress blog post. This is a blog post from one of my sites. Well, let's take a look at how that post actually looks. That's it. The contents of that post is 3 URLs. I don't need to know about how the data is structured on the back end. I don't need to know about how to format a tweet properly because it's ugly. I mean, tweets just have a whole bunch of mess in there. And tweets inject their own JavaScript into your page. You know that? This one line of code, unless you have unfiltered HTML access in WordPress, you can't just drop in a script into your editor. It'll strip it out. So you can do something like this. This is what an OEmbed response looks like. Here's that cat attack. Here's my blog post. We had cats kill our birds last year. And so here's the blog post. Here's the pictures of the sad little nest that the bird used to live in before the cat ate it. And this is using the REST API. When you post it into WordPress, it goes out, it queries the REST API to see, does this thing declare an embed? So you can declare News OK can declare in its own OEmbed, and it can say, I promise to give you this data in this structure, in this format, if you access this endpoint. WordPress has said, I promise to give you this information. This is your title, excerpt, author, some basic information. So this was the very first use of the WordPress REST API, was to make OEmbeds possible, to make it. WordPress has always been, or usually, several versions back, was able to be an embed recipient. So if you dropped in a YouTube link, it would automatically format and drop in an iframe for a YouTube, and you get that. Once the WordPress REST API came along, this was the first test, was can we make this an embed? Can we provide OEmbed? So when the very first version of the REST API was introduced into WordPress, embeds were the only thing that you could do. And it worked. This is just a simple call. I don't need to know how the data is structured as an end user, but as a developer, I know that if I hit embed, I can get the data back from this. So along came version 2 of the API. Version 2 enabled the fire hose. And it takes all your posts, all your pages, all your media, all your content, everything, and exposes it in this text format, exposes it to the world. What's the benefit to that? Well, benefit is it's super fast. You don't have to load up a web page. If you just want the contents of a page, you don't have to load up that page anymore. You don't have to load up the JavaScript, the images, all the information. You just load up a chunk of data that provides you all that stuff. So before, how many of you love XML? One, woohoo! I don't have a big love for it. But where XML is super powerful is that it's extendable. It's there in the name. Extendable markup, is it extensible markup language? I don't know, it's one of those things. So XML, RSS. Before, the two ways that you could get data out in a text format from WordPress was through RSS feeds or through XML RPC. Anyone familiar with XML RPC? I know it exists. That's about it. That's the extent of it. I know people who use it aren't really fans of it. So here's the information. Here's my feed from Big Wing. These are our blog posts. And you can see all the stuff that's in there. And that's great if you like to parse XML. Here's the same thing in the REST API, formatted as JSON. So raw data is just what you would normally expect. A standard, I like my little parser, a collection of posts. So I'm looking here, I'm looking at the endpoint is, as Stephen mentioned, is just a URL. You can use anything to grab data from this URL. Here, I'm hitting it with a get on the browser. WP JSON, WP is the namespace, V2 is the versioning, and then here's my endpoint is posts. So I'm looking at posts, the latest 10, and that was a trick for later. This is the data about the post that WordPress has exposed. So one thing that we can use this for is fun stuff like, I've got a client here that has a warning. These are really, really nice pictures. This is good looking food. This is the menu, the restaurant menu. We're in a WordPress multi-site environment. We have a corporate menu, and then 3 sites inside of that network all have access to the same menu. Normally, you would have multiple sites. You would create multiple pages and have all the content from each of those pages. So if you had a corporate menu, you would copy and paste the content, drop it in there, and there you go. By leveraging the REST API, I created a plugin and a custom post type and exposed the custom post type's data and then used the plugin to just send data. The plugin contains no logic. It contains no display. It leaves all that up to the designer. Yay, my designer. She's really good. So Susan had a design already of how this was going to look. I just had to figure out, in this case, how the data was structured. So one of the good things about how data is structured is I just have to return a promise that it's going to look a certain way. But then on the other hand, I was the one who was also ingesting that data and getting it into Susan's formatting. So lesson learned, before you start creating a promise of what you're going to return, actually diagram the data that you're expecting to return. I changed this multiple times as I went, and now I have multiple routes that return data in different ways than I would normally expect if I were looking at it now. At the time, I was doing something like, hey, I need a menu item. I need menu groups. These are just taxonomies, so I'm going to create a URL endpoint to get menu groups. Oh, now I need all the menu items. Oh, great. Now I got to group the menu items. How am I going to do that? I just kept adding new things. So when I have the front end, here's my menu. Here is where that menu data is coming from. Look at that, same menu. We're using the same theme, same content. The difference is here in this WordPress, this is a page. Here's the page content. Everything below the page content is a result of a REST API call. I don't have to use AJAX. I don't have to do any authentication. I just do a normal GET request through PHP, get to myself, and bring it back. One of the nice things about this is all these sites live in the same multi-site environment. So I know where the data is coming from. If I was doing this without REST API, I would have to make an AJAX call or duplicate the content across all of them. What happens if I add another place or we want to use this data somewhere else? How do I do that? That's where the REST API's real power is in giving data and promising that data in a certain format. So this is what the data looks like on the WordPress side for that menu. I'm going to promise to return this information. It's formatted the same way that a post is. Problem is, I added some extra fields in my response that I needed when it came time to looking at like menu groups. WordPress by default doesn't expose the media that was associated with it because the media is being added by a plugin. I can extend that code and extend the REST API with a custom endpoint that then duplicates some of the information that WordPress already has. So let me show you how that looks. Notice now we've changed WP-JSON is still the URL for WordPress to let you know that we are going to make a JSON request. The previous namespace was WP for WordPress. Now it's my custom BWFDM for Big Wing Food and Drink Menu because I'm really bad at naming things. This is V1 because I promise that once I publish version 1, my responses will stay the same. If I need to make any changes to my responses, I'll add a version 2 to add backwards compatibility and not to make developers hate me on the other end. So now, instead of what WordPress would normally return as a taxonomy, I can add my own formatting of a taxonomy. So I have an object that's a collection, and it's dishes. And this is where I messed up. This shouldn't be an object. It should be an array. It should be an array that's a collection of objects. Whoops, I messed up. I've got the image, the source set, and the URL for those really, really nice looking dishes. Why do I care about this? Anyone have an idea? I'll tell you why. It's a smaller request or smaller response. If I can customize the response and cut out all the stuff that WordPress provides, because it provides a fire hose of data, I can cut down on the size of the response. What happens when you cut down on the size of a response of anything? It's faster, and it makes caching a lot better because now you're caching a smaller object. So I've got this cool menu group. Normally, what happens if you want to see something like this on a mobile device? Well, you have someone like Susan who's really good at designing for responsive. And we get things like the website loaded up in Chrome. Look at that, it looks really good. I zoomed. So if I want to look at this menu, I have to load up the website. I have to load up all my JavaScript, all the CSS, all the images, all the multiple requests. Web pages are growing by leaps and bounds. The size of this request is, I hesitate to say, but it's probably greater than 3 megs because those images don't come cheap. But fortunately, we can do things like source set, and source set helps cut down on that. And we've got all these tricks on the front end. What if we want to do something really, really fast? How many of you know how to use Java? Anyone program in Java? I don't, but I created a Java app that displays the menu. Problem with this is I have a busted click handler, so every time I click, it crashes the app. So we're not going to click on anything, but if you'll notice, look down here. I can't even zoom. So watch down here. I'm logging out the JSON data as I scroll. It's a little slow. This is the same data, the same endpoint, the same everything that my website is using. But instead of querying for all of the website, scraping it, and then getting that data in some text format, the server already does that for me. WordPress returns a JSON response. It says, here's your data. Use it however you want. I don't care. Why is that so important for WordPress to not care about where the data is being used? People kind of freak out. What happens if now my data is exposed? Well, it's already been exposed. You've got a website. And if you're running on WordPress, you've got a website where the code base is running on about 27% and change of the world's websites. So you've got WordPress that's a huge chunk of the market. We already know how to optimize for performance. We already know how to make cool things. But anybody use WordPress on a regular basis? Okay, don't be ashamed. WordPress is cool. I love it. One of the things I hear about WordPress is it's slow. Yeah, sometimes it is. I mean, my website is super slow. Why? Because I'm on a shared host with 3 other websites that I'm running, and I'm running a beta version and tearing it up. Okay, WordPress is slow. WordPress is slow because you got to load a bunch of images. You got to rely on PHP. You got to do things like that. So what if I could create a website that wasn't in WordPress? But remember, I've got to make the website usable for content creators. If you've got a platform that runs 27-point-something% of the world's websites, you've got people who are familiar with how to create content on it. How many of you have a WordPress blog or have ever seen WordPress admin? Okay? That's something that people are familiar with, or if not, they at least can jump in pretty quickly and know, oh, here's a post, I'll write a post. They don't have to think about creating that content. What if you can promise a client that they can create content on their blog and create other content for an app at the same time, and they don't have to learn anything new? The power in that is something like this website called the 20s. There's a company in LA called Beachbody. P90X is one of their big things. Last summer, they threw a bunch of good-looking, skinny, tattooed, shiny 20-somethings in a house in Malibu. And they fed them nothing but like energy bars and sports drinks and shakes. And they battled it out to see who was going to be the next trainer. So they had a TV show. And every week they launched a new online episode of their TV show. The website was built on the front end in React and Angular by a digital agency in LA. The back end was all created in WordPress by a distributed agency based out of Australia. So I worked for XWP. My boss was in Portland. My team manager was in Chicago. I worked with a developer in Austin. I worked here in Edmond from home. Together, we built this website. But we didn't touch the front end at all. We're all WordPress developers. We don't know React. We don't know all these things. And Beachbody already has a well-established system for selling things and for drip content and managing their existing trainers. So we promised to return the data in a specific format, and we agreed ahead of time with the other agencies what that data was going to look like, what format it was going to take. And they said, we accept your data structure, we accept your promises, we're going to build a front end. They were able to make dummy content using our data structure, build out their entire front end. 2 weeks before we launched, we merged our data with theirs. They dumped their data completely. They imported our JSON. The website was already live within a matter of hours, ready for QA. We'd been doing QA testing already, but the entire site was ready because of the promise of the data that they were going to get. This is not the website that we built. After the site launched, they had the TV show. It went on. They did all their voting. They did all their systems. And then they said, OK, we have a new trainer. We're going to feature this new trainer's products. And here's a look. Here's the 20s is now a 20-minute workout that Megan Davies created. So here's Megan. Megan won the 20s. What do we do after this thing is done? We have a new website to build. We've got this data. Now we've got to do something with it. Well, because we had already agreed on what the data structure was going to be, and they're already using a system that pulls in JSON from a bunch of different sources, we didn't have to do anything. They used the existing data that we had already provided, that we had already structured. They already knew what it was going to be, so that as soon as this one launched, they could start building in tandem the next version. Modularize things. Here's a new website. They already know what the data is going to be. As soon as the new program went live, they switched from the 20s.com to this Beachbody on-demand, the 20s URL structure, and they didn't have to do anything extra. It's there. So when you use something like WordPress REST API or any REST API, you can tell your client, hey, you're familiar with WordPress. So the thing with Beachbody is they had already been blogging on WordPress. They already had trainers blogging. They had already been using it for building sites. They were familiar with the interface and they trusted it, except for one of the engineers who didn't, but I sold him. His problem was WordPress is slow. And I said, great, I don't care, because we're offloading stuff to Amazon and you're using a front end that isn't WordPress. And he was happy, and WordPress wasn't slow anymore, because this isn't. This is just data. So REST API is not magic, except when it is. It's magic in that you can guarantee with your structure that this data is going to be reusable. How do we reuse some of this stuff? We've been talking about REST and gets posts. So I want to load up my website, and I want to look at the latest blog posts. How do I do that? I hit the RSS feed, I parse XML, I format it. Or I somehow just load up the site, and my site loads everything with it, like the massive images that people like to include on things. What if I want to be like Beachbody and say, well, I want my front end to be built by someone else, or I want it to be faster? What's the best way to speed up something? Just have text. So if we use an AJAX GET request, it takes 3.1 microseconds to get that. All I'm getting is the latest posts and getting the featured image for them, and there it is. I was a little bit slow. I mean, it's 3 microseconds. What happens if I use something like fetch? I really, really love fetch. This is now cut from 3 to 0.3 microseconds, or milliseconds, sorry, milliseconds. It gives me the same information. It's the same data, same everything. So in my back end, in this case, when I'm looking at my code for that, no matter what I use, I have this build post function that just goes through and loops through all the post JSON. It creates elements in a document fragment. It injects everything into a frag. When everything is all together, it shoves it all into the DOM at once. So my markup is a single, excuse me, a single empty div. Nothing fancy. But I don't have to load up WordPress. I don't have to load up the back end. I don't have to mess with any of that stuff. Now, here's one of the funky things is, in that request, I'm getting back, let's look at, this is the request that I'm getting. So in this request, I'm getting information about the post and the slug and link, and here's all my content, a lot of content. I'm pulling in the excerpt, and then it tells me the author ID, featured media ID is the thumbnail, post thumbnail. So in this case, it's not providing me with the information about a thumbnail, it's providing me with the ID about the thumbnail. So in my request, I'm doing a second lookup, and I'm doing another, in this case, my request image function is a XML, XHTML, this one, XML HTTP request. I always forget what XHR stands for. So now, I've showed you can use jQuery GET, you can use fetch, you can use just a normal AJAX request. Still hitting the same endpoints, still getting the same data. I'm going to show you one other thing, though. Nice feature of WordPress is embeds. So we showed you how O embeds work. All you do is hit an embed endpoint. Now, it's down to 0.19 milliseconds for the request, down from 3. And all the data and image shows up at the same time. Here's the magic behind that. WordPress has context. So inside the REST API, there are 3 types of things that you can do for context: edit, embed, and view. By default, it's view. But if we do a little trick and I append, you can do underscore for the action, or you can do action equals. So I'm going to throw embed for the action, and now WordPress has changed its response. It is promised to return a response based off of the action. And now my response, I'm going to shrink this down a little bit, includes, where are we? Sorry, Jetpack got in the way. Now it includes embedded. So instead of just the author ID, it tells me that Chris, where's Chris? Hi, Chris. Chris wrote that blog post. No, the other Chris. Sorry, we have two Chris's. Who knew? And here's the information about Chris. Here's my media, not just the ID, but it's already done the hard work of doing the extra lookup. Well, it does it on the WordPress side. It doesn't do it on a AJAX request. So I'm not making multiple requests to the endpoint or to the site. It's already done it for me. And when WordPress generates this, it caches it. And so the next response and the next response are always going to be faster. So now I've got the featured media. Instead of having to do an ID lookup for media 3910 and getting the information back about that, it's already presented to me in the response. I can get all the information about it without having a separate lookup. And now I can get the thumbnail way, way, way down here. So by passing the context of embed, I don't have to make a separate request. So when you're building your requests and you're building your custom work, you can add extra data to embedding. You can add extra data to the response. You can customize the response. You should never take anything away from a response, but you can add to it. And you can promise that if you hit this thing, you'll get this. I don't like that Jetpack changes my response, but it does it in a way that's not super obtrusive. And it doesn't take anything away. So when I'm using fetch and combining fetch with fetch embed posts, now I've passed embed as the action. And now instead of looking at the response and trying to figure out where the ID is and making that extra query, I just know I'm going to build the same. This is the same builder. But now, instead of looking at what the ID is and then making a query, I just know that it's part of the embedded response. Namespaces is one thing that I don't like about XML, because namespaces and parsing namespaces with JavaScript is really, really tough. At least in JavaScript, I can just wrap some quotes around it and say it's no longer an object, it's a array, and JavaScript's like, whatever, dude, just here. Because JavaScript doesn't care about what you do. It's so loosely typed. But here's the same data, the same stuff that I did before. Not having to make that second lookup means I just shaved off another 0.2 microseconds off of a request. Now let's say I've got this cached. Every time it makes a request for it, it's already cached in browser. And so now the request is even faster than before. You can't load a blog page, a blog roll from WordPress in 0.17 milliseconds. You just can't. As much as I like to hype on performance, it doesn't beat just straight up pulling in JSON and displaying content there. There's no way to beat that. Something like this, you can expose custom data, you can expose WordPress data, you can make it so that your clients are comfortable with already building a site in WordPress, and if they have an existing site, they're already doing things with it, you can create a new site for them at the same time and partner with someone to create a mobile app if they have things like a menu. You can do all of these things without interrupting their current workflow. And then you can tell them when the time comes, we're just going to load up this new site that's hosted somewhere else. You can have it on Amazon. And you're just hitting JavaScript and passing it back. So that's some of the cool stuff that I've been able to use the WordPress API for. I don't use admin Ajax anymore as much as possible. There's still some purposes for it, but I don't need to fire off an Ajax request to a PHP file to render two other functions that you have to do in WordPress to get data out in query. I can just do a normal GET request, WP safe remote GET, and pull in the data. I can use an Ajax. I can tell someone like Toyota, who built their entire website 3 years ago on Ruby, and the entire backend was in WordPress. They didn't have to change their workflow for anything. And they had another company internally, because Toyota's got bazillions of them, built a Ruby-based website using the REST API to pull in their data. So if you want to learn more about this, api.wordpress.org redirects you to the developer handbook for the REST API. It tells you what the endpoints are. There's also wpapi.org that has all the docs, and they're changing that. The REST API handbook now is for developers and end users. You don't have to be a WordPress developer to use this. Really, it's better if you're not. WordPress developers, we're kind of weird. I don't know all the cool fancy stuff. I was talking with Steven about using Vue.js and React to make websites, and I'm like, yeah, those things exist. I should probably learn them one day. I don't know. I'm still on Backbone, and that's what I got. I don't have to know all this stuff. I have to know how to make WordPress work and give you data so that you can do front-end things on it that are really cool. Any questions for me while I'm got 7 minutes left? I just been kind of rambling because that's what I do. Yeah, Steve.
The REST API lets you send data into WordPress, right?
It does.
Have you done anything like that, like updating or creating new posts, that something else?
Not externally, but let me show you what that looks like. So I've been showing you all the GET examples because GET's the easiest, GET's unauthenticated. The authentication schemes for WordPress REST API are not built into WordPress because it's weird. So your options are to roll your own OAuth, OAuth 2. There's a company that provides a paid service for authentication with your site. The easiest way is with cookies. So if you have a login to your website, it generates a WordPress cookie. You can pass that cookie back to another end and authenticate. You're cheating. I mean, you're using a logged in cookie to authenticate and using it that way. One of the other things you can do is, if you hit the website for WordPress, hit a WP-JSON endpoint, it would really be cool if my stuff actually worked. So one thing I've learned with the REST API is caching. The WP Super Cache plugin that I have installed sometimes says JSON, nah, and it jacks it up and returns it as HTML content type. So this is not application JSON. It's still JSON, but it's being returned as HTML. So hopefully I can cheat. There's a plugin, two-factor authentication plugin, that is being developed as a feature plugin for WordPress. George Stefanis, who's on the Automatic team, builds security things for Jetpack, has been working on this. This allows authentication with a single password, so an application password. So if you ever use Google and you say, well, there's some weird system that doesn't take my Google password because I've got two-factor authentication enabled, you can generate a unique password that's some weird long encoded string, and you can authenticate using that instead of cookies. So if you use something like this plugin, you can generate unique passwords for your site, and you can authenticate with that. WordPress.com. I don't even have that installed here. So WordPress.com has their own REST API. If you have Jetpack enabled on your website, Jetpack will enable WordPress.com's new editor that I hate. But it'll enable their new editor built in React. And instead of editing posts on your site, you're editing them in WordPress.com in their editor that's making REST calls back to your site authenticated with your cookie through Jetpack every time. So it's doing put and update requests. You can do the same thing. Anyone remember Windows Live Writer? That was like the best blogging app for Windows users ever. It was, oh, I love that thing. Windows Live Writer has their own integration with WordPress. So if you ever look at a WordPress site, look in the headers and you'll see there's a manifest file for Windows Live Writer, an XML file saying, hey, this is how you do it. It authenticated with cookies, and you could use this external app. It'll use this external app to authenticate with your site and pass data back and forth. XML RPC was what was used before, and people could create their own apps and use XML RPC and deal with that pain. With the REST API, it uses the 4 verbs. It uses get, put, update, and delete. So they're just straight up HTTP calls. They're requests. You pass authentication with your cookie or with your one-time password or unique password, and you can make all those things. This is where the action or the context comes into play. So we had context of embed. You change that context to edit, and it exposes more fields that your editor can use to be able to edit things like metadata and the content. So by default, it doesn't have all custom post types enabled. So if you have custom post types, custom work, it's possible to make that hidden in the admin UI and then only expose it through the REST API and through an external editor. So if you have special fields that you need to write to, instead of making database calls, you hit an endpoint on the REST and you can update data through a custom endpoint and through custom taxonomies, terms, meta, all that stuff. I don't have any practice of doing that. I just know it exists. Yes, sir.
You see anybody using the API with build tools like Run and Bolt to generate static pages off of that data?
I've heard such things exist. So the question is, does anyone use a REST API for build tools like Grunt, Gulp to build static pages? I've heard of such things. I've not seen them in practice. There is a node package called WP API that was written by, it is written by Adam White, Adam White, who used to work for Boku, web development agency, JS agency in Boston, and he's the maintainer of that one. And we're integrating things in the new Gutenberg editor is using the REST API as part of its internals. But for a static page generator, I don't see why not. I mean, you're just scraping data and injecting it into a DOM and then saving that fake DOM as a page. That seems to me like it would be a faster way of doing it. Things like, I could see something, I have a service called DNS Made Easy. And DNS Made Easy, if there's a DNS failure, it'll roll over to an Amazon bucket. And you can serve static content out of that Amazon bucket through your DNS provider. I could see a service running a cron job that gets your JSON endpoint, loads that JSON somewhere else, and then if it ever fails over, then load up that JSON into a single page app or just generate static for a cache off of that. But I don't know of any that do that right now. You could be the first. Yes, ma'am.
So REST API is a way to pull down WordPress off of WordPress and use REST API for original version.
Yep.
So but it's using code.
It is using code. So it's
You got it on code.
it's still running on the WordPress side, it's still running PHP. It's still querying the database. it's still doing those things. If you want to customize it, you need code. If you don't want to customize it yourself and you're okay with the posts and pages and the data that comes out of WordPress, then you're still going to need code somewhere else. You just don't need to know PHP. Whatever language you're familiar with can do that. So at some point, it's code.
Well, it's all code, but
Yeah,
even WordPress is code.
right.
So, but the thing is, you're taking your WordPress site and putting it into REST API, so it's faster. But you're leaving it at WordPress.
It's still staying in WordPress. So with Kirby's, this menu system, this is still a WordPress site. Theme, it's still making the same normal WordPress calls to pull up the data. It's just exposing that data in a different way. So your pictures can be quicker. You can do more things with it. It's possible this can be kind of slow because it's a website and websites can be slow. It's possible to just get the data, which then points to all those assets. And then you want to do something like building a static site or caching your own. So instead of querying the page in a fake browser, pulling that information down, and then saving it somewhere else.
So if I have a .com and a .biz site, I can run them together with REST API.
With the REST API, yep. It'll be quicker.
And doing it GoDaddy.
Pretty much anything will be better than go through GoDaddy. Quicker, not better. I will say, disclaimer, I think GoDaddy's getting a lot better. They're not killing elephants and flat, yeah, I can go off on a tangent about them. GoDaddy's getting better, but they're still slow. So a couple things you can do is performance. Taking a look at, here's a normal doing AJAX request inside of WordPress. They figured out that Windows running on PHP 7 speeds up things immensely. So you can speed up on the server side by switching to PHP 7. That'll speed up your site. And using the REST API in these tests, just a base install running things, they saw a 15% increase in speed using the REST API than using AJAX requests that did the exact same thing. And the reason for that is when you're using AJAX inside of WordPress, you're having to still run PHP to return the JavaScript. You have to run the JavaScript to query the PHP to do all the work to get it out. With the REST API, it's already done it. It's still running in PHP, but it's a lot faster because it's been tuned to only return this data as a promise. It doesn't have to try and figure out what data you have. So you can do things like if you have a website on WordPress.com, which doesn't allow customizations, or you have your own website over here that's in WordPress and another one that's in WordPress or not in WordPress, the combinations, as long as REST is being used and you have API that's returning data, you can merge those together in a third site. So if you have two sites that maybe you don't even own, but you need to get access to their information, like a feed. Normally it would be an RSS feed. You hit those and drop it in. You can make requests like Beachbody did, where they hit different APIs. They hit WordPress, they hit their own internal stuff, all these services, and brought them together for one site.
So like your Facebook, your tweets
Can all be on one. When those embedded tweets we looked at, it's making a JSON request. It's doing an API request just like this to Twitter, and Twitter's giving you can get the plain text back from them. When you ask for an embed, they're going to promise to give you a formatting. So they're going to inject JavaScript and CSS and an iframe in there. You can ask just for the text and speed it up your page loading. So if you use like a Twitter widget and they have all these things where Twitter just says, here, drop this in your site and there you go. You can do that, or you can roll your own and query their API, get just the text and load it faster. because it's not requesting all those extra assets. And that's, Facebook does that internally, Twitter does it, Google provides all these services internally where you can hit REST API to do things. My first experience with any sort of API like this was with a company called Ooyala. Ooyala is a video hoster for like CBS. CBS.com uses Ooyala, CBS News. I worked for a company that used Ooyala to serve up the videos. We had a hard drive failure at our video producer, and we lost the originals for all of our videos. But we had already uploaded them to Ooyala, who does not provide access to those original videos. But they exposed the internal URLs to those original source videos through their REST API. So if you authenticate and you say, yeah, this is who I am, I have an account with you, they'll say, okay, here's all the data we have on your videos. Do something with it. And in this case, I was able to query those and then pull the source files back down from them through their REST API, just because they gave me the location to it. So you can do the same thing with like images in the case of doing this here. When I'm loading up the image, it's just providing me a URL to the image. I can choose to display it, or I can choose to offload that to another service that maybe compresses those and stores them somewhere else and then returns them to me.
So you could keep them at icon,
What's that?
you could keep them at icon and then pull them through REST.
If iCloud has some way of providing those as like a CDN type of deal, if they have a public URL to them, you could use this to query all your images and store them somewhere else. You'd have to basically download them to your iCloud. So it's a way you could back them up. Instead of having to do a file download, if you don't have access to your server, say you're on GoDaddy and you don't have access to the raw data, or you have FTP or whatever, you don't have those things. If you're working for a client and you're helping a client move from another service that doesn't provide access to their files anymore, they're holding them hostage, but you can access their REST API to get where those files are, then you can suck them down locally and save them and back them up. So you could do something like this where you're backing up your content. You don't have to do a database backup. You just back up all the content into a single file, and then if you need it, that file tells you where your assets are, where your images are. And it's a way of speeding up backups or recovery or transferring data later on. A lot of this is theoretical. I mean, people are doing it. I just don't know who. I assume that anything that I can think of, someone's already done it and done it really well. They just haven't shared it yet. All right, we are over our time. Sorry, I get long-winded. Thank you all for coming. I hope you can find some way to use this in your work. And if not, then at least you can share it with someone else and say, hey, WordPress is cool. It does this. So thank you for coming and for your questions. If I held the mic, I'd drop it.